Welcome back to Decentralized Nutritional Science in the frame, lens, and context of structural violence and economics. Following from our previous video, we've taken a look at the various frugal sources of proteins that are not only viable in terms of their macronutrient and micronutrient values, but also their plausible choices. We're going to extend the discussion towards that of exploring other plant-based alternatives, but also we're going to be covering and discussing sources that may not be the most ideal if they're consumed in copious quantities, especially in long-term view. Hence, individual research and discretion is always advised because, once again, none of this is meant to be taken as a safe panacea or safe dietary or nutritional guidelines that may be applicable to anyone or any readers, irrespective of medical conditions. Therefore, please research responsibly and self-tinker yourself critically. Pea proteins, generally speaking, are unfortunately just as expensive as their dairy counterparts, which is consisting that as whey proteins and casein-based proteins. Well, casein is actually seen as the more viable and viewable forms of protein due to its long-lasting, long-digestibility profiling factors. But long story short, pea proteins can be quite economical in that they can be quite versatile to be used in both savory as well as sweet-based meal applications. This may seem to usually be seen as a bad thing, in such that people will immediately dismiss it, that it is, just because it is low in methionine, they will immediately dismiss it as a non-complete form of protein. Well, we can actually use pea proteins to our advantage because, once again, when it comes to maintaining a favorable protein intake, one must also be aware that maintaining diverse amount of lean muscle meats or lean protein sources that is already overly high in phosphate and methionine based content must also be complemented by other sources that are also lower in methionine, in which this is where pea protein isolates or concentrates do offer some utility in that regard. So to use pea protein concentrates, we can use it in both savory and or dessert-based recipes. As according to our previous video made recently is pea protein meatloaf. All it takes is 2 eggs, tomato paste, apple cider vinegar, salt, pepper, with generous amounts of fatty sources in the oven for 228 degrees for 30 to 35 minutes. Let cool briefly before serving, and there we go. And that pretty much constitutes a good meal, semi-vegetarian meat replacement recipes for anyone who is also trying to dial back their methionine intake ratios. However, having said that, pea proteins also have their own minor disadvantages surrounding, yes, as we all know, lactams and anti-nutrient phytic acids, in which both have been very well documented and very well studied to have inhibiting properties in the uptake of several key nutrients, zinc, magnesium, phosphorus, calcium, to name a few, in which, therefore, it is, once again, not a good idea if we were to solely focus our protein intake alone from just this particular plant proteins alone, in which that is not wise. So when it comes to pea proteins, it's unfortunately, as discussed earlier, it is quite disappointing for one to find that yes, it can be as expensive as whey protein isolates and concentrates, which is surprising given their plant derivative nature, as one may expect that it should be cheaper. But unfortunately, general research-wise across various vendors in the Australian market proves somewhat of a disappointing findings. So keep that in mind. 1 kilogram of pea proteins can be purchased in anywhere around about hovering range of $20 to $30, in which, once again, quite surprising. So when it comes to the overall rating wise out of 10, perhaps out of this own author's opinion and experiences, it will be somewhere between 6 to 7. However, this is once again depending on the vendors and the locality in which it is prudent for readers to conduct their own research. Now it is time for us to consider the not so good options, in which this can be all summarized into the reasoning as such that, 1, due to their overly processed nature, and that 2, of their somewhat highly questionable way of production and manufacturing processes. So, first on the list will be TVP, textured vegetable proteins, and or soya chunks. This has been discussed extensively in our previous video and presentation series, especially towards that as expired food guides and experiences. So keeping in mind that is also another worthy feature upload presentations for newcomers who are new to this concept initiative. But suffice to say that beyond its highly questionable manufacturing and production processes, soy protein isolate has been, once again, attributing such concern towards its anti-nutritional factors, or ANF for short, has been well studied amidst various medical research journals and mechanistic studies to have found that not only it inhibits mineral uptakes, but also with the fact that in a greater soy intakes of anything to do with soy protein isolate seems to confer higher risk towards kidney stones, which is not surprising given that soy protein isolates as well as its industrial derivative is also implicated amidst its concerns towards that of high oxalate content. This author may also would like to add to that, given from its prior years of consumption, on and off consumption, is such that there may also be some psychological factors in which, suffice to say that it is quite difficult to describe what those are, but semantically this author would still say that it is not of a optimal regard in that sense, if that may help. Tilapia and Basa farm freshwater fish. On paper, they, technically speaking, are actually quite enviable source of proteins, low in PUFA, and they're actually, well, low in fats in general, but also they're actually are pretty much lean sources of proteins, in which they also contain some vitamin B12, B vitamins, as well as all the usual complete source of proteins. And unfortunately, it's for the benefit of the doubt, it might be better and wiser for readers to actually watch the various documentaries and the various insights, independent insights and articles and thoughts surrounding where these fishes are farmed and raised, and hopefully they can make an informed decision. All this author would like to pretty much try to convey the message is that, is it dangerous? He would say, no, it is not completely dangerous, but it is questionable in how one actually perceives to the quantity that is acceptable. So it remains up to individuals' own introspective balancing between the pros and the cons, and make an informed decision. Nothing more, nothing less. So the next thing that is actually quite difficult to recommend, that will be coming alongside products such as ham and chicken luncheon, or in Australia we often call them as ham or chicken luncheon knobs, Devon and or Bologna, as it's also alternatively called. Macronutrient-wise, it is somewhat of a less qualitative source of protein per se, because once again, there are some trace carbohydrates, but one key particular industry additive in which it has been attracting some controversy in both mainstream media and scientific research papers, in which they still seem to be quite conflicting with each other, is surrounding the usage of industrial emulsifying agent and an enzyme in which, ironically, this is actually occurring in nature, known as transglutaminase enzyme. What this is that, as indicated by the ending three letters ACE or ASE, in which that is used to speed up chemical reactions to stabilize protein structures, to speed up processes amidst the outcomes for blood clotting mechanisms, and even interesting enough, pardon the pun, spermatogenesis. With this cross-linking enzyme, one of the main key concerns is such that it is a suspected allergen, especially those who are quite sensitive or those who are suspected of carrying genetic susceptibilities towards celiac disease. There is always going to be some debates or disagreements on any of the selections that this author have proposed in order to pitch forward. Indeed, there are many other food items that is yet to be covered here in this presentation alone, given that this is a curation of 5+ years and still ongoing to this day inside of nutritional inaccessibility. However, keeping in mind as such that perhaps a safe, broad and or gross generalization would be for one to stick to animal-based proteins, but still also allow liberal explorations and experimentations to some degree, depending on one's own tolerances or intolerances, sensitivities or insensitivities towards that as the plant derivative versions of such proteins. However, keeping in mind that there is nothing else, by the humble opinion of this author, as such that the so-called debates surrounding nutrient completeness, nothing still can be comparable to the value of organ meats. No, it is not in any way deadly as such that it will give everyone large population scale-wise food poisoning per se, and no, that it will not in a hindsight at producing mass scale micronutrient deficiencies as soon as upon consumption, and know that it doesn't actually confer serious side effects and or once again relating back to the previous fear as micronutrient imbalances, these imbalances here and there. We must not forget that imbalances are an inherent part of life. To balance it out, however, remains an increasingly difficult individual task and therefore an individual obligation to take ownership, scientific ownership towards reclaiming curiosity and autonomy. Nothing more, nothing less. So that wraps up and concludes the entire roundup of the series of top frugal source of proteins that this author would like to have shared his just N equals 1 thoughts. So hence, as a general reminder, none of this is meant to be taken as a prescriptive dogma per se. Despite all of the scientific citations and the journalism that is actually provided and shared here throughout this video presentation are just there for informational sake and educational purposes to give for yourself an informed consent for you to self-tinker and self-explore and self-confirm these findings towards your own circumstances and implications. And remember as always that this is all taken in the context of Australian demographics and Australian food market. Keeping that in mind, thank you once again for your partaking of discussion amidst the internet's least visited independent thoughts on wellness and decentralized nutritional science in the frame, lens, and context of structural violence and economics. Leave it forward, and thank you for watching.